Hello, everyone. I hope you guys had your coffees and teas and ready for passing the Inferno G10 test with Fire Server, uh, hosted by Rich.
All right, well, I'm Rich Almeida, and I'm going to teach you about how to pass Inferno for the G10 test kit with your FHIR server. We'll use FHIR server today, but this should apply to any FHIR server. So first about me, I'm Rich Almeida. I work for FHIR. I'm a technical consultant. And what does that mean? I do everything, all kinds of hats. I do compliance. I test our software against Inferno and for other testing tools. I develop sometimes, pretty often lately, and I make sure that our software is compliant with whatever regulations are happening in the United States. So what are we going to learn today? First, we're going to become familiar with how to walk through the ONC Inferno testing suite for G10. We'll go through some prerequisites that you need to do in order to even get Inferno started. Like you have to load up your server with IGs, of course. And I'll highlight important aspects before, during, and throughout the presentation. We're actually going to do Inferno live, so I'll talk about it as we go. We'll highlight out of test processes. So there's some things where you'll go into Inferno and then you'll leave to interact with either Postman or whatever. We'll go through some of those things, and we'll also I'll create an error on purpose so you can just see what it looks like and maybe we'll solve it. We'll know what we did, but I'll show you what it looks like when there's a problem. And then I'll give you some insider information into the actual certification day. So when you sit with your, ours was Drummond, but you'll sit with a certification body, and they're going to want you to see the presentation. I'll try to give you some pointers about how that day is going to go. So first, what is G10? Hopefully you know a little bit already, but it's a US regulation where basically every US hospital provider practice will need to have the ability to present data via a FHIR server. There's all kinds of other regulation in there. For example, multi-factor authentication and security and things like that. I'm not going to cover that today, but I'm definitely available through chat or after this if you want to talk about some of the other requirements that you need to meet and maybe you want some advice on. Inferno, when we talk about Inferno, most people think about the G10 test kit, and that's kind of how we refer to it for the most part. But actually, Inferno is a framework. It's an entire API and testing kit system where you could build your own tests. So it's actually, we'll say Inferno and we mean the G10 test kit, but Inferno is actually a bigger framework for creating your own tests. Completely open source, you could go use it for other things. So let's get started. First, if you didn't know, you need a FHIR server and an authorization server. Again, we'll use FHIR server products today, but this is agnostic. Most of the workflow will look the same in any other authorization server, just maybe the screens look different. You also need to load US Core, Smart on FHIR, and bulk data export into your FHIR server. I purposely didn't put numbers here because there's some options you could choose. We'll do a specific set of options, but you could do core 3 or 5. And then if you don't have a FHIR server and you still want to maybe participate in this, like after and watch the video, you can go to our ebook and walk through using our public endpoint. The only caveat I just want to mention is that that's a little bit behind. It's going to work for our public endpoint right now, but what I'm going to show you today will be a little bit newer software that we're about to release. So another getting started item is you need data. So I provided data in the link to the actual presentation, but you're going to need 2 patient examples if you want to create them yourself. One is a primary patient that all the other resources are going to link to, and then the second is to show that bulk data export can do more than one patient. You put both of those in the group. And then you're going to need at least one user assigned to that patient. So it could be referring it to as the patient or just assigned by FHIR user or patient context. So here's an example here I have on the screen. We were going to use test US Core 4, and that can be the FHIR user itself or the patient claim. And then, of course, I'd already mentioned you need all the profiles linked to that first primary patient. I just recommend using the examples I provided on the link. It's much easier. You'll need to set up an authorization server to use reference tokens. This is very important because Inferno won't test successfully without, because only reference tokens can be revoked, and you need to go through the revocation process manually later on in the test. And then here are the links that you need to register your smart app Inferno with. So they're here really for the presentation, but you can copy and paste them and that'll get you started. It's also in the Inferno documentation, but I thought I'd highlight it. Here are a couple of recommendations I have from experience. As we go through the tests in a minute, don't skip around. Actually, do it the way I do it. First test, next test. You could actually run everything from start to finish. There's the options to do that, but I don't recommend it. Also, if you were to skip certain tests and go back, you could revoke a token, and then now your tests are failing, and you have to figure that out. So if you just stay step by step, without fail, as long as everything else is, properly set up, you'll be able to pass Inferno. You're going to need a client. We're going to use Postman today, but that's not required. You can use any FHIR client or whatever, the SDK. We're going to introspect some tokens, and then we're going to revoke tokens as part of the test. That's a requirement. Some recommendations. There are gray test items that are not required, and you will pass Inferno perfectly fine without doing these things, but I recommend that you just do them because on test day, you may be asked, why didn't you set up maybe these resources like location? And it's just better to have them go from gray to green and everything passes and we don't have to talk about it. Another thing is you can have devices, but if Inferno only requires implantable devices, just build those instead. So just save yourself some time and make sure everything just kind of goes green when you're done. At the very end of Inferno, there's this visual inspection portion that you're going to go through with your certifying body. They're going to ask you questions, basically the exact questions that are in the visual inspection. So be prepared to go through those and just pre-answer them maybe on the side. This is one example. So we're going to go through the first test, and it's going to ask at the end if you present an offline access scope being shown to the patient when they go to authorize the request. And so because you read the visual inspection sections first, then you'll know that you can just present that early on. So you'll want to keep like a little, we're gonna instruct this in this order. So you don't give a presentation, by the way. You actually, when you present to your certifying body, you just present Inferno. But it's nice to have like notes. I'm going to say these words because I already know this is coming. So this is one of those examples. And then you also need, we'll go through this more in depth later, but you'll also need primary documentation links, your API links. And so here are some just examples that you can look at as well. Another highlight in the visual inspection, we'll get to it in a second. It's really just a yes or no, and then you put the answer, is did you do these things? So an example of that is, did you demonstrate that you can validate tokens? And the way to do that is you'll show your introspection process, like manually outside of Inferno. And then do you have the ability to show refresh tokens that can that can be valid for more than 3 months? And there's really no way of doing that. You're going to want to show just your settings. Like here's a setting, and this is how we enforce that. And you'll have 90 days or whatever your settings are. And then obviously the URLs and a few other things that you're going to need to just enter in on certification day into the visual inspection section. So the exciting part, without further ado, we're going to pull up Inferno. Here are the settings I'm going to choose. Let me just mention them for a second. You could pick US Core 3, 4, or 5, and Smart App Launch 1 or 2. So you could pick whatever you want, whichever combination works for your FHIR server and your auth server that you have, and you can get certified on any combination of these. What we've done is we've picked 4 and been certified on, and Smart App Launch 2 and Bulk Data 2. So we're just going to go through that exact thing. I'm literally using the server that we've certified on just in February. So let's pull that up. And for those remotely, I have to represent. Just 1 second. All right, I've already navigated us here to Inferno, and we'll click on, so it's inferno.healthit.gov, and I've navigated to this link here, Standardized API Test Kit. So here we are as that screen again. So we're going to pick US4, Smart 2, Bulk 2. Click Start the Test. All right, and so what I meant about earlier is to run this in order. There's a button up there that says Run All Tests. Do not click that button. You're going to want to click on the first test and click Run Tests, and then walk through these in order. So I'm just going to go ahead and click that first one, Run Test. I can't have time to go through every single box here, but what I'm going to do is just talk about as I go, because we're actually running this live. We're going to certify the software now as if we were doing this, and it would take much longer. It's really about 45 minutes. I've condensed it down to about 20. So here I'm going to put my FHIR endpoint. So I'm going to do some copying and pasting and just try to talk through what's going on here. This first test is the standalone patient app. It's basically your standard flavor way of connecting to a FHIR server using Smart on FHIR. And then there's the scopes here and what are going to be allowed, and we'll click submit. And then these boxes, this is going to happen a lot, and we'll run through them faster later, but I'll show you this one here. So follow this link to authorize the server. This is as if the user is going to authorize this smart app, which is Inferno in this case, to use to access their data. So you could change these buttons here, and that offline access item is exactly this last checkbox here at the bottom. And that's where you would say to the proctor in the test, see, we have the option to do offline access. And you just checked off that one visual inspection item that comes later. So I'm just going to go ahead and click yes, allow. And in the background, what's happening is that it's going through quite a number of things that I wish I could cover here today. But one of the important ones is that it checks the well-known configuration endpoint. It will, it's a little bit of just JSON on the screen, but it actually checks to see what is the token endpoint. So you can see, if you look carefully, you can see connect/token is how you ask for a token. And so the well-known endpoint is asking the FHIR server, how do we know how to talk to the authorization server? Like, where do I get a token and where do I refresh tokens? And so this is that answer. And this kind of flow here with this messages, requests, inputs, outputs, about, you can go through any test and look at that. And when we have an error, and I'll show you in a second, that's where it becomes important, because you'll actually see what the input was. You can maybe test it to the side in standard, like maybe Postman workflow. And then you'll see what the output is, and it kind of gives you some information about what the problem is. So I'll just show you just one more token refresh. So, we asked for a token and we received scopes, and we got the refresh token and the access token. And so this part of the test passed. So let's go on to the next test. So this is limited access. What this is going to do is basically the same thing, but it's going to say that we only want to allow patient condition and observation. This is the one I'm going to fail on purpose. Everything else is already filled in because we've already used the same client example. We use the same secret key, same server, and some of this data has been provided from that well-known endpoint as well. In particular, this authorized came from the well-known endpoint. So I'm just going to hit submit, and we'll follow the link again. And here, I wish I had a button for this, but we're going to uncheck all of these. And I'm going to purposely uncheck observation. That was one that it said we want to see. This is how we're going to create that error and navigate it and see how we can research those. So I've just unchecked everything but condition and patient. It's expecting observation. I'll say yes, allow. Oh, and we have a failure, exactly what we're looking for. So here's where you would take this X, the problem, it'll drop down, and then it'll explain the problem. In this case, it does explain what's happening a little bit as to why we couldn't get resources. And then you can go to that same kind of flow where I said you can check the inputs. And here we only said where we were allowing condition and patient, and it'll say what the outputs were. I'm sorry, in this case, the expected resources are listed in the bottom. Sometimes you'll see what you received, and then sometimes it'll say what it was expecting. Keep moving here. So the Practitioner app, this is a little bit different than the last one. Limited access was just like the first test where we're just trying to change what the access is that the registration has. With the Practitioner app, there's actually more about the smart app launch as if you're in an EHR, or if you're launching an app specifically out of the EHR using context. So somewhere along the lines, you need to pass along the patient context. So that's what's important here. So I'm just going to type in Click submit. This one's going to be a little bit different. So here it says we're waiting for Inferno to be launched from the EHR. So this is more like when we need to pass on. This is exactly like I should say when we pass on the launch context. So it's expecting you to use this URL, and I'll show you exactly how you can do that now. First thing we're going to do is go get launch context. This is something that happens behind the scenes. So here I have a little postman called get launch context. Our URL is connect launch context. What you want to do is make sure that you have all of these things. It could be different in your auth server, but you want to have everything kind of set up predetermined. So I already have like my basic authentication all set up as an administrator. So the FHIR server, it's not a client registration. And because this is happening in the EHR, so only the EHR would be would understand this password and username. And so what we do is we pass along what is the context that we want. So in this case, it's patient US Core 4. Again, this might look a little bit different in your FHIR authentication server. So this is the patient we want. I'm going to go ahead and request context. This is the launch context identifier. I'm just going to bring it over to my other monitor. Put it into that URL that you saw earlier, and it'll look familiar once I show it. So I'm just going to paste that into the URL. So here you can see I've appended that number that I just got, that UID, into the launch equals, and the rest of it is basically what it asked me for in the bottom. So before it expires, it's like just a couple minutes. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and hopefully it receives exactly what we've asked. It has, and then it's going to now allow me to go continue the registration process, where similar to before, which resource types are we going to allow? And I'll say yes, allow. And that test passed. I didn't fix limited access. Why don't I just run it again? So I'm only going to check the resources that it said, which was patient observation and condition. And then that way we can get a green on this one. Single patient API. This is a little bit longer test. Things should be populated based on what we've already entered earlier. Here's where I was kind of talking about, simplify this for yourself. Don't make additional patients. Let this kind of just run itself. So we already have all the data built for linked to that primary patient US Core 4. In that package of data on the web, the link that I sent will have all of these care team, condition, everything's linked properly to that patient. So you can take that, make your own copy, and then make your own patients. This one takes a little bit. So I'm going to switch over back to the slides. All right, so we'll talk about some certification day insider knowledge. So be prepared for the proctor to throw you a curveball right as you start, because that happened to us. And he was like, oh, can you change the client ID and the password for this stuff? And you've already set up Postman and you're ready to go. And he's like, change this. So just be prepared for that. Think about, maybe take some notes about where you put all these things in Postman, in your settings, because we had to change settings in FHIR auth. We had to change Postman, authentication settings, things like that. So they're not trying to mess you up, but they want to see that this is dynamic, that it's not all hard coded or something. So be prepared with all your documentation, the API, your certification landing page, that's going to say what you're certified to. Even though you're not certified yet, they want to see a page that you're ready to present. I'm certified to these criteria, G10, D2, all the different criteria. You're going to need your multi-factor authentication links. So how do you use our multi-factor authentication? All the documentation has to be linked in the chapel. And some other attestation items, for example, your internal workflows for bug resolution and things like that all need to be documented. And it doesn't have to be public, some of these things, but they might want to see that on certification day. So make sure you have all of your documentation ready as to what it is that you're actually certifying to. It's not just about getting Inferno done. So this is little side stuff that I wanted to share with you. Make sure you side document, don't just have all this in settings, but the client IDs that you used for certification, the passwords, the Pixie settings, all your users, all your patient IDs, encryption settings, because if you have to reproduce this for another time, or if there, God forbid, there was like any type of audit somewhere down the road, you want to be able to recreate exactly what happened on certification day. So make sure you document all these things. This is how we certified that day. They have a video, of course. You can't video as far as I know with Least Drummond Group, but at least if you have the documentation, you can run back through it. URLs also, the FHIR server URL that you used, launch context, URLs, things like that. And that's just good to have, even if it's not specific or it's changed over time. Pre-configure your Postman request as much as possible. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but have all your basic authentication in there, your URLs, create exactly what I showed, which is like a little certification type collection, and just have everything in there to go ahead and just run things. You don't want to waste any time and get stuck or typing in things wrong. I actually did it just an hour ago. I went through this whole thing and I typed use core 4, and I was like, oh, it's broken, what's happening? And I had to troubleshoot it. So it's good to have things just like copy paste ready to go or already filled in. So we're going to go check back on this test. It's done. The next test is multi-patient API, which is bulk data export. This one also takes a little bit of time. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this going. And these are the same settings. You could have different settings for bulk data export than you do for maybe the standard FHIR server. So that's why this allows for you to enter in maybe different URLs, but we use the same ones. So I'm just re-putting this information in here. And then again, I've created this such that the group is very easy. I have just the 2 patients we talked about in our earlier slides. And there's implantable device codes and things like that, but these are all optional. So we've gone through and just skipped that. We should be good. All right, so I said pre-configure Postman. We're going to wait for that test to run. Have a single presenter. So that was myself, but I had my team standing by just listening. It's totally worth it, because when we had a curveball, we had to change a password, then I missed a step. Someone was able to say, because you're nervous, maybe. I was definitely nervous. Certification day, you want to make sure this goes well. I missed something when I was changing the configuration settings that they asked. Christian said, oh, you got to change this. Boom, thank you. And so it's just helpful just in those little things. They're actually developers. So if something went real wrong, we could just jump in and maybe take a small break, figure out what it was and fix it. But it's really good to just have somebody else that's not under the pressure to just listen in and make sure that they can help you out. So I totally recommend that. And it came through for us. And then run the test a couple hours before. I probably ran it too many times, but definitely run it that morning. You don't know if Inferno pushed out a new release last night or whatever, or if maybe you change your configuration. Just make sure that's really just working like an hour or more beforehand. Let's go back and finish the tests. So this one's still taking a while. I'll skip to this visual inspection section while we are for that test. So here is, I can't pull it up to run it, but here are all the questions that I was talking about earlier, visual inspection. So the questions are, has the health IT module demonstrated support for application registration for single patients? I'm not gonna read them all to you, but each question has something to do with what you've either seen, what you're attesting to. So some things aren't tested because it's kind of difficult to do with software directly. Like do you support Pixie 384 versus whatever? And the answer is yes, but we tested only one today, so there's different things that you can answer. For example, the very last one was just added after our certification, which I'm probably going to have to answer to at some point, is do you support the since parameter for bulk data export? And the answer is yes. And That wasn't recorded, so I'll end up having to just like modify our attestation. So your certifier may come back to you. So it's good to check on this stuff too. Do you support TLS 1.2, those types of things? And now that multi-patient's done, I can go ahead and move on. But the way this looks is they're yes or no questions that you walk through with your certifying body. So you'll just say yes, and then they may have you type some notes that they dictate to you, or you put your URLs in these different, very specific places. So let's back up and let's go through the rest of the tests and see if we can get through Inferno in a couple minutes. This is the public launch. And public launch is used for maybe there isn't the ability to share a secret key, and it doesn't really matter because it's internal to the EHR, or there's just, you know, a situation where it doesn't make sense, but we're going to use the user authentication to ensure that this is the data that they're allowed to get. So this doesn't have a launch secret. That's the key to this one. But everything is already filled in from previous tests, and we just go through this thing, and I will just click through these fast now. And we pass all of these. And I'll just pick on one of these just real quick. Actually, something more interesting like headers. So you'll have inputs. Nope. Here we go. So click through these things, see if you can get familiar with what they're doing, what the input is. There's a little about section on every section that says, you know, this is what this should do. Thank you. So you'll want to go through this. Let's pick on some of the more interesting things. So token revocation is a great one because you have to jump out of Inferno to do this. So here, this is where you might get, oh, before you revoke the token, can you actually introspect it and check that it even exists, that there isn't some kind of weird situation happening? You know, so what we'll do is we'll introspect the token, the access token, by just pasting it in here using an introspection endpoint. And here we get, you know, my user, the client ID, and anything else that's interesting to introspection. And then we will go through and actually revoke the tokens. So we'll actually do the refresh, which will get rid of both. And here, it's not intuitive, like you don't know that you need to do this. So these are steps that you know, you'd have to learn from a class like this. So this is why I wanted to highlight some of this. So we've revoked the token. Let's go back and make sure that Inferno passes. So we'll click, so we'll say yes. Prior to running this test, we did revoke the token, submit, and hopefully green arrows, great. The rest of these, these last couple are like just to prove that your FHIR authorization server handles sort of bad situations. So errors, so performing an invalid launch, and then you attest to it. So it's actually the proctor wants to see that when you perform an invalid launch, that you get an error. And then you would attest to it. And then only at that point, they'll say, go ahead and click a test because I've seen this error. So it's like not quite software testing, it's more visual inspection. Invalid tokens, this is another one where the Inferno is going to send a bunch of invalid stuff to your FHIR server, and it needs to respond with errors. If it responds correctly, or it needs to respond with error, not that things have passed. And so here we have responded, you know, that this is an invalid token, for example, you know, these types of things. And here again, you can look through the inputs and see what was returned. Same thing, this is all invalid Pixie. I'll just keep this moving. So we have a few minutes for questions. And we're just going through this test over and over, and it's sending a different bad form of a Pixie code. When you do this on certification day, you'll go much slower. You'll show that the settings can be manipulated. You'll end up clicking open a lot of these boxes to show that that you've actually passed, that there aren't little warnings, or maybe there could be like gray items in here that technically pass you, but the certifier will want to know about it. And then this last one is very similar to the Practitioner app. Where this is a smart app that's maybe in the EHR. And so we also have to, again, pass the launch context. So I'll go back over here. I'll get another launch context. that into the URL. This is actually good. This can happen sometimes. This is nothing against ONC and Inferno, but sometimes it just sits here at a number. And the way to get past that, it's really easy. You just refresh. I know, but I don't know why it does it. It's once in a while. It could just be a network blip. So last thing is the visual inspection. I do have a minute. You're going to go through and click yes to all of these to make Inferno pass. The ones to highlight are more of the ones down the bottom, like the since parameter is fairly new. You're going to want to make sure that the proctor may want to see that in the moment. So you'll have to run a bulk data export completely out of Inferno, and then he'll let you say yes to this. There's other ones like, did you use a JSON web key set to authorize the bulk data export, and you'll want to show the setting of that. So you'd open up your settings, you have this key, things like that. And here we go. We've passed Inferno. The last thing is this report. You're going to want to print this report. Your proctor will ask for it. You'll click show details print. You're going to want that for yourself on certification day, but you're also going to provide it to the certifier along with an email with all kinds of things with your documentation and that type of stuff. I just have a what did you learn slide, but we'll take questions now.
So you had mentioned the kind of optional gray tests that may not be required to pass and receive this result. Can you provide a few examples of what those are and reasons why folks who are trying to test against them may not support them?
Oh yeah, so you may not support, you don't have to support, it's not required to support the medication resource.
Okay.
But if you can, you should just try to pass all the tests, makes everything look better. So the medication resource is optional, which I think it's a little bit weird in the tests. I'm not sure if it's optional in US Core, but you could just do a medication request, which has a direct identifier to the actual code of the medication rather than a pointer to a medication. Do you understand that?
Yeah. Are they typically those types of optional gray? Are they around payload, or is it more around this kind of transactional and OAuth? Is it almost always like things that we might see as must support, but having some conditions?
Yeah, it must be not must support.
Okay.
And that's why Inferno doesn't test it.
Got it.
I don't know for a fact, but I can only
Okay.
guess. And so you don't have to have that. But if you have the ability, you might as well show it and test it, because otherwise they are going to have you take a screenshot or take note of the fact that you didn't have the medication resource.
Got it.
Because technically you should upgrade and let your certifier know if you change things in your certification, which would mean you now support that, right?
Got it. Okay. So on like choice elements, or like that's where we're seeing often that be an optional test.
Right. Inferno doesn't really check on all of those things. I think it does more at the resource level,
Okay.
but we have seen some things where like we didn't connect the dots between patient records and things properly, and we had to fix it.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
This Inferno is a great framework for testing. You've now shown certification for G10. Are you aware whether there are also programs starting for? Okay, thank you.
I anticipated your question. There are already some tests, and this list has grown pretty quickly over the last, I don't know, 6 months. There was just a handful in here, and if you just click back from the Inferno, you can see additional tests that have already been built for Karen, Blue Button, and different things. And again, if you use the framework and you have a specific thing that you want to use, let's just say even internationally, you could use Inferno. Theoretically, it's open source to create a test suite. It's like the open source version of Touchstone. I'm not going to compare them here, but something that you could build that you can create.
We have 1 more minute. Any last minute questions? I think it's all good. Thank you. Thank you, Rich, for the
Okay.
presentation. I know we had few hiccups, so if you have more questions, feel free to reach to Rich. But I think we got the story what
Yep.
Rich was trying to tell. So thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, and please see me. Oh, good. Thank you. And please see me if you have other outside of Inferno's certification questions. Be glad to answer and tell you about some other things that we had to do. Thank you. Take care.